Many of us think of toys as something to keep the kids occupied or a reward for good behavior. But toys and play have benefits that extend beyond playtime, from teaching the value of teamwork to unlocking empathy. Joining us now to tell us more about these benefits is Gonzalo Riva. He's the Chief Operating Officer and Lead Strategist for 21 Toys. Welcome to the agenda this summer.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, what exactly is 21 Toys?
21 Toys, well, we're a little startup out of Toronto. We design and make toys to teach kind of abstract, funky skills that I think we all value, but that traditionally schools have had a tough time kind of teaching and unlocking, and that they're kind of often hard to measure. So we started with the first skill, which we considered a very core skill, which is empathy. And from there, we're building out a suite of other toys that will teach other kinds of skills.
Okay, we're going to talk about the skills. We're going to talk about the toy that you brought in just a minute. But I have to ask you, why not 20 toys or 22 toys? Why 21?
So yeah, and the short answer to that is it's 21 toys because it's toys for the 21st century. For 21st century skills and 21st century thinking, which can be a bit of a cliche. It's a bit of kind of a diffuse word. Now everyone kind of says 21st century, 21st. But we definitely thought that kind of the toolkit of what schools use was kind of limited. It tended to be a lot of textbooks and now maybe a bunch of touch screens.
Very 20th century.
In the 20th century. And maybe what we need to do now is think about other types of learning tools that have a deep history but that we've maybe ignored in recent times.
All right. You brought a toy in. It looks kind of to me like some kind of building blocks, castles, and various pieces. But just explain this 21 toys.
Sure. It's not a construction game at all. So this is our first toy. This is what you're looking at. These 10 pieces are the empathy toy. And it's a very simple game, or devilishly simple. It seems like it's simple, and then it gets very complicated because of who you and I are when we're playing.
Okay.
But the way the game would work is we have two identical sets of pieces. So you'll notice there's a dark group of pieces and a light group of pieces. And they have various kind of tactile and semantic clues. You'll notice they kind of have a rough bit and a soft bit. And they slide and lock together in just thousands of little ways. So I might take, say the two of us are playing, and a teacher comes along. We're students in a class. A teacher might take my set and put it in a particular pattern.
So if the teacher builds an object.
The teacher builds us a pattern like this.
Okay, and are we watching while the teacher's doing this?
We can be, but we might not be.
Okay.
So the teacher might make a pattern like that and then hand it to me.
Okay.
And then my task will be to get you to build the exact same pattern with your loose pieces, which are made out of maple instead of walnut. The challenge is that while we're trying to do this, we're both blindfolded. So
I was thinking, it doesn't look so hard, so introduce the blindfold and the whole game changes. Okay.
Exactly. So I'm actually blindfolded before I even get this pattern from the teacher.
Okay.
So I'm left with nothing but my words to describe to you what the heck it is I have in front of me.
Okay, I want you to pick it up. I want you to close your eyes. I'm going to close my eyes and just quickly explain what you might be saying.
So say you imagine you're holding a bunch of loose pieces, that you've got them in front of you on a table, right?
Okay.
And this is supposed to be easy because I've only got 4 pieces here. But I've kind of got, I've never really touched these pieces. I haven't seen them much. I saw them right before we started. And I'm kind of, okay, I think I've got like a long piece here that sort of feels like a base. And then there's sort of a, I don't know if it's a triangle or a circle or a cog or what is it, but then it's got sort of like a smooth center, and it's got these little, what are these, like nubbies, and they kind of align, and I can tell that one piece is sliding with another piece. So I'm trying to figure out, well, this is hard enough for me just to kind of understand, and now I actually have to put it into words that you're going to understand to be able to build this thing from scratch. And do I start from the bottom up or the top down? And what part is the most important? Because I might tell you, oh, put this where, imagine the piece is a clock and it's at 5, and that's where it slides. And you might go, well, that makes no sense to me.
Right, or I'm frustrated because I don't understand what your instructions are.
Exactly, and suddenly I have to get really creative and go, okay, well, that made sense to me, so now I have to think of a second way, which wouldn't have been my typical way to do it, in order for you to be able to understand this particular challenge. And same with you, you're giving me feedback, you're telling me this isn't working for me, and you're kind of telling me, it would help me if you said it this way, or if you kind of first dealt with the intricacies of maybe this piece first, because that's what's really confusing me.
Okay, let's open our eyes, and let me ask if that was awkward, closing my eyes on television for so long. So it's about communication.
It's about communication, it's about empathy, and what we think of as the flip side of empathy, which is creativity.
Okay.
We don't tend to think often of creativity and empathy going hand in hand. But really, when you unlock empathy, when you force people to kind of stretch that muscle and think about being more empathic and understanding the other, it's a deeply imaginative act to put yourself in someone else's shoes. So yes, empathy in and of itself is important. You get compassion, you get generosity, you get understanding of the other. But empathy as a skill is really kind of the gateway to thinking more nimbly, being a more interesting kind of critical creator of things, and coming up with new languages and new models of communication.
Okay, I think we have a video of kids playing this game. I just want to show that. Let's roll that tape.
I can't see it. I know that. Like flower thing. Wait, what? I can't hear any of that. What are you saying? I wasn't focused.
Are connected to the large arrow on the side that has one dot protruding forward.
Where's the arrow facing?
That's right. I was just, yeah, that's let's start with that.
Okay, Gonzalo Riva. It looks fun, first of all, so I guess that's important when it comes to any toy. But explain to me, I mean, we see this kind of toy or something similar to it in a big retail store, right? Kids building blocks and so on. What's the difference between this and building blocks, let's say?
You know, I know it looks like a construction toy. We don't think of it as a construction toy because there's no kind of, it's not a puzzle with one way to end up building it. We kind of see it as, it's kind of a mirror or a bit of a Rorschach test where the way that you play it, the things that come out of the discussion between you and I are really kind of the point of the game. Because you and I might play it one way and do super well. And then suddenly we switch out, maybe we bring in my sister who does not communicate with me very well. And all of a sudden, it's a very different game. So we don't like to make toys that only a single person could play with, because then it's kind of only testing and developing individualized skills, which are important, you know, cognition, spatial reasoning, all that kind of stuff. To us, the really interesting problems of the 21st century are going to be about the things we can only solve together, the things we can only solve collaboratively. So what if we made toys and games and challenges that sort of mimic and act as a metaphor for those kinds of things, the problems that only emerge when more than one person's involved?
Give me the metaphor. What are we talking about?
I mean, I think the metaphor is what happens when we begin to work in teams? What happens when we need to envision and execute projects? What happens when we need to solve problems that are super complex and have lots of dimensions to them that no one solved until now? Well,
Climate change? What are we talking about?
Climate change, homelessness, being able to talk to your family. I mean, it can be a big problem or it can be a small problem. But I think the issue is that at school, we tend to equip kids with content. We give them knowledge, but we don't necessarily kind of teach them how to integrate it. Or it's only recently that we've started to think about that. And until recently, I think school had a model of, it was a push model. It was content was being put out to be consumed, a lot like TV, and you took notes. And
we're changing the way we do TV.
We are changing, yeah.
Okay, when you see children play with these toys, what do you observe or what have you learned in terms of the difference the way that kids play and the way that adults play?
It's really interesting. Kids take to it, kids are better at it for sure. Kids take to it much more easily because they're a lot closer to the roots of play, and they've more recently been playing, and they haven't been told that play is bad, play is a distraction, play is a waste of time. So they have a lot less kind of hang-ups about diving into a game. What's interesting is adults, they take a little bit longer to sort of begin to play with this, and they're a little bit self-conscious because of the blindfold. Once they start, though, at the end, because the real value of this game is kind of the debrief, is when you take your blindfold off and all the observers can tell you what they saw. The interesting thing is adults have complex insights about what just happened. And they kind of go, oh, wow, I thought I was a better communicator than that. Or I could have sworn that this would have matched by the end, and they're completely different, and I can't understand where this went. And this actually reminds me a lot of a situation when I was working on a project, or this reminds me of the last time I had to have a very difficult conversation with someone, and we were just talking past each other. So I think they link the play metaphor to something in real life a lot more easily. With kids, I think you can tell it's working, but they're not going to vocalize it right away.
And you've introduced this into schools in Ontario.
Schools in Ontario and Quebec, you know, we've got pockets around Canada and the US. So a lot of different types of schools are using it. I think
Not just public schools?
No, public schools, private schools, all across the K-12 spectrum. We have some really interesting kind of cases where teachers who do special ed are using it, or teachers who deal with youth at risk are using it. But to us, it was important that it not be seen as kind of a niche learning tool, because the idea was we need to kind of change a little bit about the mainstream, and we need to put something more creative into mainstream classrooms. So we need to speak to what teachers need and what they deal with every day, where they're kind of having to hit curriculum points all the time, but also keep the tool open-ended enough that it kind of changes the culture a little bit around what qualifies as learning.
And we just talked a couple of minutes ago about how adults play with this. Have you introduced this to business corporations? Because it seems like a pretty good tool. I mean, when you were telling me how people might, the observers might think, I'm thinking, I know, I already have a sense of what people would tell me my hang-ups are, my weaknesses are in terms of communicating. So do you introduce this into businesses?
Yeah, we've had HR departments actually. They buy the toy a lot. Facilitators, corporate coaches, they'll take them on retreats, on executive retreats. And it's super funny, the stories that come out of that. I remember we were doing a workshop once, and there were two people who were playing, and there was a group of observers, their colleagues were observing them. And they take the blindfold off, and when they're kind of talking about what went wrong, what went well, somebody in the observer group goes, what you did there wasn't working because you weren't listening to what the other person was telling you they needed. And suddenly there was a bit of a, you could kind of hear the pin drop for a second. And I asked, what would have happened if you said that about a regular part of your work? What would have happened if you said that while working on a project together? It might have been seen as kind of a little bit offensive. But because in that kind of safe bubble of play, we can address each other's behavior without kind of taking it personally.
All right. You sort of touched upon, we've traditionally had this parochial way of teaching in our schools. And the idea of teaching empathy in schools is somewhat of, maybe a novel one. And why do we need to teach empathy in schools?
I think we need to teach empathy more broadly than we've thought about it before. We tend to think of empathy as a moral trait. I think there's moral imagination to empathy, and it makes us good people. And that's all well and good, and there's terrific programs like Roots of Empathy that are already in schools.
That's where they take a baby in.
They take a baby in right as the kids are about to become jerks, right, in kind of like middle school time. And it really changes the culture and the climate of the classroom. And that's wildly important. We think of empathy, because we come from a design background, we think of empathy as also the starting point for innovation. You don't create new things that people need, that people are going to be delighted by and surprised by, unless you can really understand them and you can really kind of get inside their head. So for designers, for entrepreneurs, for creators, empathy is core. And also just, I think, for writers, for people who manage people, which is a lot of people who work in teams, which is almost all of us. We kind of never got taught at school how to work in teams. We were just kind of put in teams and then told, go do it. And a lot of us learned that we kind of just don't like working in teams. That's what we learned about it. So I think empathy becomes kind of the core skill to developing a creative way to approach problems with other people.
And when you put these in tools into put these tools into classrooms, pardon me, and the teacher takes part, what have you learned from talking with the teacher? Why do they want this in this classroom, and what do they observe?
We've learned everything from teachers. We started when a couple years ago, we just had this toy, and we thought, we can imagine 7 or 8 kind of types of scenarios or lessons that you can draw out of this. And we had a few really cool pioneering customers in different kinds of schools and school boards who took the toy in. And we kind of checked back with them a few months later, and they said, yeah, we used it for the bullying and the leadership, and we did it for that. We've actually also been using it in English. We've been using it in math. We've been using it in history class. And suddenly we realized we had been incredibly limited in how we thought about our own toy, our own tool. Because teachers kind of, again, it's kind of this abstract mirror. They see what 2 students do with it, or what a group of students do with it, and they realize, this is helping me discuss this other topic in this course, in this curriculum. This is helping me unlock their thinking. Because when you play, you're unguarded. You're kind of your truest self. You really kind of engage with the problem. You're in this kind of state of flow. And that really helps you kind of think more quickly and in a more interesting way, which is kind of, it's funny that we tend to think of play as the opposite of work or the opposite of productivity, when really it can be the gateway to a lot of the interesting stuff of work.
I understand that you hear from teachers, but how do you know it works? How do you know that this thing unlocks empathy? Where's the proof?
I think it's all the stories that educators have told us from kind of across Canada. I've had a teacher who told me, it's my favorite, she said that the insights and the lessons that might take years with some students to kind of learn about what are the blind spots in their communication, what are their assumptions, she could get it out in just a couple periods. if they just kind of play and then they talk about it. I think part of the reason play is often seen as a waste of time is because it doesn't follow a script. And school is very much a script. We have prescribed curriculum with predictable outcomes, and that's great because it makes most people's lives easier. But play doesn't follow a script, and so it's kind of seen as, this isn't really going to hit the outcomes. But once you kind of abandon that need to always have a script, you find that people get so much out of it as they're playing.
Okay, make the connection for the skeptic who says, kids go to school, to learn reading, writing, math, whatever. How does this make them better at learning that?
I'm so glad you said the reading, writing things. In the 1970s, it was pretty clear the top job skills were kind of reading, writing, arithmetic. And not a week goes by that you don't read an article now in a business publication that says, right now in 2020 and 2030, the top job skills are going to be teamwork, collaboration, interpersonal skills, the skills that allow us to adapt our thinking and learn to learn. So, how is this related to that?
Yeah, so if I say, well, my kid goes to school because I need them to learn to do math better, or I need for them to learn English as a language and grammar and stuff, how does this toy make them become better at learning grammar? Is there a connection?
Yeah, and it depends on the subject. With language, we find a lot of teachers, they realize that as the kids are playing, as the students are playing, they need to be incredibly descriptive because they don't have the biggest crutch that most of us have, which is sight. They can't go that one or like that. They can't say which a lot of kids do. And so they have to get much sharper at kind of creating a bridge of language amongst each other. So a lot of teachers I've heard of use it as kind of almost a diagnostic tool. They kind of have students play at the beginning, and they play a couple weeks later and a couple weeks later, and they see how almost their essay writing gets better. And the way they communicate and they even talk in class about something, the way they kind of ask questions, changes because they realize that the way they're saying something might suddenly be misinterpreted, which is not an insight that I think we have at a young age. We just assume that what we're saying and what we're thinking is immediately clear to everybody else. And if you write an essay, and then a week later you get your grade back, and it's kind of, this was not quite clear, you're so removed by then from the act of having written the essay that you might remember kind of what it felt like to write the essay, and you might link it to the feedback your teacher's giving. But when you're playing, the feedback is instantaneous. You're right there. You're taking a risk, you're trying something with someone else, and then they're telling you that didn't work. So all of a sudden you're kind of adapting and recalibrating your language right on the spot. And that can be pretty intense, I think, for adults even, and for kids if it's kind of one of their first experiences.
We've touched on this throughout our conversation thus far, but I kind of want to just go for it with you.
Go for it.
How would you characterize Ontario's education system's approach to teaching students in 2014? We're in the summer now, but in September 2014. How would you characterize it?
I think we're really lucky to be a startup out of Ontario working on education, because Ontario is world-renowned for what it's doing with education. If you separate Ontario even from the rest of Canada, suddenly the averages also all go up. So in rankings, we're great. And so there are incredible pockets of light throughout the province. We meet administrators, we meet teachers, we meet school boards. It's super cool what people are doing with 21st century skills. What I would say is that it's not entirely the system's fault. It's simply that Ontario is a very good engine, sort of like a Ferrari engine. But what we need to do is move past internal combustion. What we need to do is move to electric cars. We need to move to other kinds of technology. So there's nothing, people like to say, education's broken, education's broken. I actually don't think education's broken. One of my favorite educators, Eric Rosenberg, probably the most forward-thinking teacher I know, he often says, education isn't broken. It's actually a super well-designed system. It's just kind of irrelevant for the world we live in now. And he says this as a teacher. He says, we're preparing people for a world that doesn't exist because the system of school was designed 150 years ago when we needed kind of an obedient, uncreative, industrial kind of worker population. And we're still more or less delivering content in the same way, and slowly cracks are appearing. But I think for a lot of us, it's kind of not fast enough. And we thought, when we started this, we thought, well, we could yell at the sky and we could say, well, we wish the whole system were different. Or we could try to kind of acknowledge how hard it is to be a teacher, where a lot of teachers know that where the flaws are. A lot of teachers didn't sign up to grade report cards all day and have to force kids into kind of uniform standards of performance, and watch kind of kids who are probably super talented at certain things, but things that just aren't being measured by school, and just kind of watch them kind of flail. Teachers didn't sign up for that. So we kind of thought, well, what if we created a resource that acknowledges that teachers have goals to hit and they have bosses and report cards. So we kind of created these books around the toys so that it doesn't just look like play. There's scaffolding, as teachers call it, and you can lead to outcomes. But at the same time, something that kind of just nudged ever so slightly and said, maybe every now and then, in the middle of the day, there doesn't need to be a script. Maybe the really good stuff comes out when there is no script for the students, because suddenly they realize that things could go anywhere. And that's when their brains kind of flick on, and that's when they get really kind of communicative with each other and with their peers, with their parents, with their teachers. You
mentioned, a teacher really embracing this, someone that you really respect. So I'm wondering, though, we still have a quite a large education system and arguably quite a traditional one. Mm-hmm. How receptive is the system en masse to sort of this unorthodox, if I can put it that way, approach to teaching?
I couldn't tell you about the whole system. We're young and small, and most of our kind of uptake, most of our sales, most of the interest in the case studies that we have, it's always been word of mouth. It's always been a parent who sees us at a conference and says, I love this, I'm going to talk to my school, or it's a principal or a superintendent who says, this is exactly what we've been talking about, but we kind of always talk about 21st century skills, and we don't have any kind of tangible artifacts and exercises and very simple things that we can kind of slot in, because we can't change the whole system overnight. And I think it's always been kind of anecdotal. It's been people kind of realizing, hey, innovation isn't just technology and touchscreens and computers, it's actually the way also that we approach learning in the classroom. So I could never speak for the whole system.
We've been, talking about this within the context of Canada and Ontario particularly. Are there other countries that are embracing this way of teaching, if I can put it that way?
New approaches to learning? Yeah, I think if you were to think about a gold standard, though they're very humble and they're very careful with their words. Finland, I think, is an extraordinary
Which comes on top of every education ranking everywhere.
Without almost even caring. I mean, their focus in Finland is actually around equity, is making sure that every school is as resourced as every other school, every classroom is resourced. They invest a lot in professional capital, they trust their teachers, they demand a lot of their teachers, but they trust them to experiment. Every classroom is sort of an experiment in curriculum design in Finland. Teachers can personalize and customize their instruction, and it's not really about prescribed curriculum that then gets measured with standardized tests. So they're doing really, really cool things. I don't think every lesson from Finland can be applied to every place on earth, but you don't even need to go that far. I mean, even in Canada, in Ontario, you've got really interesting boards like Peel, the Peel District School Board, the Ottawa Carleton District School Board, who we've been in discussions with. They're doing really great stuff. They put out a report called Unleashing Potential, and it's very much about kind of trying to figure out how to do this creative stuff. But Saskatchewan, actually.
Where I'm from, thank you.
Saskatchewan as a system is beginning to embrace almost closer to the Finnish way of kind of moving away from kind of standardized snapshots of students' performance and putting more autonomy into individual schools and classrooms and into teachers' hands, because they're the ones that actually know the student.
Okay, thanks for the shout out to my home province. Well, I don't even know how to phrase this. This is going to be the wrong word. Is there a danger, wrong word, in teaching too much empathy? Is there a risk? Is there a downside?
You're asking the wrong guy for that. I mean, I'm not sure that there's a danger in getting people to think a lot more about their words and how their words are going to be heard and who's on the other side of an essay, who's on the other side of a television program, who's on the other side of anything. I think the danger is in sort of looking at new methods and saying, we don't have time for this because we've added this new test that we need to speak to, this new layer of kind of outcomes that we need to do, or it just doesn't fit into one of the bullet points in the curriculum document, because we'll always add more of those things. I don't think anybody's worried that we don't have enough rigor in the system. I think the danger is in not giving even a little bit of oxygen and of daylight to something that maybe can't be quantified as easily with a standardized test, but that you see teachers and you see parents and administrators and students really, really respond to it, and they kind of go, I mean, when we do PD sessions sometimes with teachers, because a school or a board might buy a whole bunch of toys, and they go, can you come in and train us on the toys? And we go, not really, you don't need us. It's all in you, you're very, very creative. They go, no, we'd really like it. And we go and we do a PD session and we train them. And this is how you could use it in the classroom, and this is what this teacher did and this teacher did and other school boards. And they're really wowed. And a lot of them come up to us and they say, this is the best PD session I've had in years. And I think that they couldn't really tell me why. I think they just had fun. And you said it yourself, you said, this is all fun, but
Right.
there's always this assumption of fun can't possibly be productive. And I think right now with the economy kind of going up and down and you see new kinds of companies emerging that are doing business very differently, you start to see that play is kind of just a form of tinkering and of risk-taking, which leads you to kind of innovative outcomes.
Thank you. Appreciate this. Like this toy. I find it weird even calling it a toy. I like this learning tool. Thank you for coming and telling us about it.
It's a Trojan horse. We use the word toy to get people to play with us, to get people to be interested. It's an easy word, I think. And then once they start playing it, then they realize it's a tool, and we go, well, you know, yeah, we're not married to the idea of toys. It's just how else do you get? You can't just walk into a classroom and say, okay, kids, today we're going to talk about empathy, or we're going to analyze our communication with each other.
Yes.
What you can say is, let's play a game, and then we'll talk about what happened afterward. And then we'll see maybe what we learned about that. And then they go, oh, game, okay. I'm not on somebody else's script. There's no outcome here. I'm interested now. And then they get involved.
I will try it with my 4.5-year-old. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you so much.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.